What if the knowledge you were never taught wasn't hidden from you, but simply existed in a language your culture refused to learn? What if occult never meant secret? There's a word that carries centuries of fear embedded in its syllables. Occult. Say it out loud and watch how it conjures images of shadowy figures, forbidden rituals, dangerous secrets locked away from common people. But here's what almost no one tells you. The word itself simply means hidden or concealed, not necessarily by intention, just hidden from view. Think about what that actually means. When something is labeled occult, it doesn't automatically imply conspiracy or deliberate suppression. It often just means that the dominant culture at the time lacked the framework to translate it, categorize it, or control it. Indigenous healing practices were occult to European colonizers not because they were kept secret, but because they operated on principles the colonizers couldn't comprehend. Symbolic languages were occult to literal-minded institutions, not because they were designed to exclude, but because they required internal preparation to decode. Throughout history, knowledge systems that emphasize direct experience over doctrine, personal transformation over collective belief, and symbolic perception over literal interpretation were systematically marginalized. Why? Because they threatened the very foundation of institutional control. Power structures, whether religious, political, or academic, depend on standardization. They need clear hierarchies, predictable outcomes, easily enforceable rules. But here's what gets unsettling. Knowledge rooted in subjective experience, altered states of awareness, and symbolic meaning-making doesn't conform to those requirements. You can't standardize a mystical experience. You can't create a rigid hierarchy around practices that emphasize individual sovereignty. You can't easily control people who have direct access to transformative knowledge without intermediaries. And this opens a door few dare to walk through. What if most of what we call occult knowledge was never actually hidden? What if it was always accessible, but the structures of power deliberately taught us not to see it? If this resonates, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. How cultural dominance turned perception into heresy. Every dominant civilization creates a boundary. On one side, acceptable knowledge. On the other, forbidden understanding. The placement of that boundary reveals more about power than about truth. Consider how this played out across centuries. Ancient mystery schools taught practices designed to alter human perception, expand awareness, and trigger psychological transformation. These weren't fairy tales. They were methodologies, refined over generations, for accessing non-ordinary states of consciousness. When empires rose and needed to consolidate ideological control, these schools became threats, not because they were false, but because they offered a competing framework for understanding reality. The pattern repeats endlessly. Islamic Sufism preserved mystical practices that mainstream religious authorities viewed with suspicion. European alchemists encoded their psychological and spiritual insights in chemical metaphors because literal religious interpretation would have gotten them killed. Indigenous shamanic traditions maintained oral lineages of plant knowledge and consciousness exploration that colonizers couldn't comprehend and therefore had to destroy. What's fascinating is this: the suppression was rarely about the validity of the knowledge itself. It was about control over meaning. Who gets to define what's real? Who has authority to say what's dangerous? Who determines which forms of human experience are legitimate and which are delusion? Comment if this ever clicked for you. And this is where it gets disturbing. The same dynamic operates today, just with different language. Modern scientific materialism has become the new dominant paradigm, and anything that doesn't fit its framework gets labeled pseudoscience, woo, or superstition. Not because it's been disproven, but because it operates outside the accepted methodology. Research into non-local consciousness, marginalized. Studies on synchronicity and meaningful coincidence, ignored. Reports of mystical experiences during meditation or plant medicine ceremonies, dismissed as hallucination, even when they produce measurable psychological healing. Why did symbols become more dangerous than weapons? Here's something that should make you pause. Throughout history, authorities feared symbolic knowledge more than they feared physical weapons. Why? Because symbols operate below conscious awareness. They shape perception, influence decision-making, and create meaning before rational thought ever engages. Ancient initiatory traditions understood this deeply. They didn't teach concepts. They transmitted experiential keys encoded in myth, ritual, and symbolic action. A student didn't learn about transformation. They underwent it. The symbol wasn't a representation of something else. It was the thing itself, operating on a level where belief and reality interpenetrate. If this is helping you see differently, leave a like. It helps the content reach others. This terrified institutional power structures because it couldn't be controlled through conventional means. You can ban a book, burn a library, execute a teacher, but you can't erase a symbolic language that lives in human psychology itself. Archetypes recur, patterns re-emerge. The knowledge resurfaces under new names, adapted to new contexts, but fundamentally unchanged. Look at what happened during transitions of religious dominance. When Christianity became the official religion of Rome, it didn't just replace pagan belief systems. It absorbed their symbolic vocabulary, recontextualized their rituals, and integrated their sacred sites. Why? Because the symbols themselves held power that transcended any particular theology. The most unsettling part? This process never stopped. Today's corporate logos, political branding, and technological interfaces all deploy archetypal symbolism to influence behavior beneath conscious awareness. The knowledge didn't vanish. It just migrated from mystical schools to marketing departments. The language of symbols still shapes human perception. Most people just stopped learning how to read it consciously. How initiation protected knowledge from those who weren't ready. There's a concept modern education has almost completely abandoned. The idea that certain knowledge requires preparation, not because of elitism, but because of necessity. Transmitting transformative understanding to an unprepared mind doesn't just fail, it can cause harm. Traditional initiatory systems recognize this. Mystery schools, esoteric orders, shamanic lineages, all operated on graduated levels of revelation, not to hoard secrets, but because the human psyche needs scaffolding to integrate experiences that challenge fundamental assumptions about reality. You don't teach someone to swim by throwing them into the ocean during a storm. This created a problem for external observers and institutional authorities. From outside the system, graduated initiation looked like deliberate exclusion. It appeared secretive, elitist, threatening. But from inside, it was pedagogical necessity. Symbolic knowledge operates differently than informational knowledge. You can read about ego death, but until you experience it directly, the concept remains abstract. You can study descriptions of non-dual awareness, but understanding only comes through direct perception. When authorities demanded these schools open their teachings for public inspection, they were demanding something impossible, not because the knowledge was being hoarded, but because it couldn't be transmitted through the channels of mass distribution. It required relationship, context, timing, and readiness. So what happened? The knowledge went underground, not hidden, but encoded. It survived in art, literature, architecture, and music. Alchemical texts preserved psychological insights and chemical metaphors. Fairy tales encoded initiatory journeys in narrative form. Sacred geometry embedded cosmological principles in visual patterns. The knowledge never disappeared. It just learned to hide in plain sight, waiting for those prepared to recognize it. What if we're living through the same pattern right now? Pay attention to what's happening in this moment. There's a resurgence of interest in practices that were marginalized for centuries. Meditation, once dismissed as navel-gazing, now studied in neuroscience labs. Plant medicines, criminalized and demonized, are being researched as breakthrough treatments for depression and trauma. Ancient breathing techniques are being recognized as tools for regulating nervous system function. What changed? The knowledge didn't. The cultural willingness to look at it did. And this reveals something crucial. Most of what we call occult knowledge was never about supernatural powers or magical thinking. It was about technologies of consciousness that didn't fit the dominant paradigm's understanding of what's real. Right now, at this exact moment in history, We're watching the boundary shift again. Practices that were heresy become therapy. Symbols that were dangerous become tools for meaning-making. Knowledge that was forbidden becomes scientific research. But here's what remains unsettling. The pattern of suppression, marginalization, and rediscovery suggests something deeper. Maybe knowledge systems don't disappear because they're false. Maybe they disappear because cultures periodically lose the capacity to perceive them. And maybe they return not as new discoveries, but as old rememberings. If this video shifted something in your perception, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you catch what comes next. Drop a comment with which part hit you hardest. The question isn't whether the knowledge was hidden. The question is whether you're ready to see what was always there.